Chapter 41, A Mission Agency Discovers the Fruitful Practices of Movements by Doug Lucas. Introduction. Our mission organization launched in 1978 with a noble goal, to send lots of missionaries to work among the unreached. In the 1990s, thanks to careful thinkers like Dr. Ralph Winter, we sharpened our focus towards unreached people groups. Our goals no longer counted workers alone, but in addition, the number of unreached people groups being engaged. We carefully trained all our workers in language learning and identification with locals. We emphasized church planting. We hoped and prayed that each team of workers was engaged with the people. These workers would only need a year or so to plant each new congregation. We fully expected that it would take longer, of course, to train up the nucleus of new leaders. Sometime after the year 2000, thanks to researchers like Dr. David Garrison, we began setting goals for church planting movements. In this third version of our organization, we noticed that our beachhead churches sometimes stayed beachheads. By contrast, in the book of Acts, the disciples did more than establish a single new church in each region of the country. In the book of Acts, the disciples did more than establish a single new church in each region of the country. God added to their numbers. Accordingly, we began urging our workers to plant churches that would plant churches. Our goal-setting process began measuring not only churches planted, but also churches planting new churches. By 2010, we were engaged in a bit of a revolution. I'm not even sure what to call it, but for lack of a better term, we'll call it a disciple-making movement. Thinking. The difference might seem subtle at first. In fact, it was very fuzzy to me at first as well, but once understood, the outcome was quite profound. The fruitful practices. Regardless of your opinion of DMM practices, the electricity and sheer energy generated by DMM thinking is hard to miss. While earlier trainings focused on tactics and strategy, DMM was at first too simple for my mind to grasp. One of the central tenets was articulated by DMM trainer Curtis Sargent. It is simply to be a disciple worth multiplying. Isn't it just like Jesus to bless a system of practices that focus on changing from the inside out? David Garrison had identified extraordinary prayer as being first of several critical factors in launching church planting movements. But for some reason, it took us a decade or more to understand that this extraordinary prayer had to begin inside of us as workers rather than in some infrastructure or campaign. In other words, to change the world, we had to change ourselves. Our early efforts at launching movements had been heavily influenced by American business practices such as strategic planning. Now it almost seemed too simple to tell a new worker that he or she needed to acquire passion for telling God's story. I guess that we want our jobs to be tactical and strategic. Maybe somehow we must think it makes us look more intelligent. Training workers to do prayer walking and facilitate 3/3 groups seem too easy. The group's time together consists of 3 simple elements: look back to evaluate and celebrate obedience to God and recalling the vision, look up to see what God has for them in that week's Discovery Bible Study, 3, look ahead to determine how to obey God and pass on what they have learned through practicing and setting goals in prayer. Another practice first described by Garrison in his landmark book, Church Planting Movements, was even harder to grasp. Our temptation, when the new believers begin encountering persecution, is to remove them from the context. Some have referred to this practice as extraction. No matter what it's called, it's the first response of the human heart. The trouble is, once remove a practicing believer from his or her context, the momentum stops. Not only can this new believer no longer reach his or her household, okios, But in addition, the fire and energy are gone. Somehow, in ways we don't understand, God seems to bless those who are persecuted, and the outcome is amazing. It seems odd to highlight obedience and accountability as core practices of launching movements. Haven't we believed in obedience all along? Yes, but somehow we want to equate obedience with mostly learning about Jesus instead of focusing on doing what he told us to do. It is good to measure church attendance, but it's even better to figure out how to measure whether or not those attenders actually do anything about their faith. Again, pointing back to a core teaching of Curtis Sargent. It is a blessing to follow Jesus. It is a great blessing to bring others into a relationship with Jesus. It is a greater blessing to start new spiritual communities. But the greatest blessing is to equip others to start new spiritual communities. For a couple of decades, our organization focused on bringing others into relationship with Jesus. Then we focused on teaching them the concepts of the Bible, almost equating spirituality with knowing concepts. But Jesus didn't want people who merely knew things. He told them that if they loved him, they would do his commands. One of the toughest practices is to grasp discovery-based learning. Perhaps it's so difficult because it's so easy. Critics always are quick to accuse DMM practitioners of dumbing down the gospel. After all, shouldn't new believers receive in-depth training before we entrust them with the job of telling the story of Jesus? But the truth has been staring us right in the face for centuries. How long had Jesus known the man who was possessed by the impure spirit? In Mark 5, 1 through 20, before he sent him back to his household, Okios, to tell him how much the Lord had done for him. Maybe half a day at the most. Whoa, we've been seriously overthinking this. And this man in Mark 5 was about to change history for his home in the region of Decapolis. Those are essentially the core elements of bad WM. I think it stands for be a disciple worth multiplying. Passion for telling God's story, praying for those in persecution but not extracting them, obedience and discovery-based learning. The truth is now it can take as little as 20 hours or so to train a disciple to start multiplying. 20 hours. Exactly how does this DMM process unfold, and what do we ask our team members to do daily? We teach them how to move into a new area, learn the language and culture, and pray a lot. And we live in a consistently spiritual way while meeting the felt needs of the community. Our workers seek to become disciples worth multiplying. Anticipating that seekers will notice, we introduce these open people to stories about Jesus and his life. We might mention a passage which Jesus teaches about honesty and explain, for this reason, we're returning a small amount of money that many would consider petty. Then we ask if the individual likes the idea. If the individual responds positively, we ask if the person would like to hear more about the teachings of Jesus. The people who say yes to these kinds of questions are the utmost importance to us. They are what some trainers call persons of peace, hearkening back to Jesus' words in Luke 10. When sending out the 72 disciples, our workers start 3/3 groups with these interested parties. In those studies, our workers simply introduce a new story from Scripture, then ask questions such as, what did you like about this passage? What seemed difficult? What does the passage teach us about God? What does the passage teach us about people? If we believe this passage is from God, how should we obey? Who are we going to share this passage with before we meet again? With whom can you tell your story or your own testimony? Those who are seeking will want to meet again. Those who are seeking will want to meet again. Those are the people in whom we need to invest our time. We repeat these processes until our new people of peace become believers, then disciples, then group leaders on their own. Using this simple approach, our workers expect to start groups which multiply. It works in the developing world and also works in the USA. In one field, our team worked for about 15 years to establish the first beachhead church. Then by introducing DMM principles, they multiplied into 7 groups within the next 12 months in another field, a Muslim land. The group struggled for 10 years with almost no fruit. Upon beginning to apply DMM principles, they had 5 new groups launched and multiple baptisms within the first year. In yet another field, our workers weren't even sure how to begin for the first 5 years. Upon implementing DMM practices in the next 17 months, they saw 112 groups begin, with more than 750 individuals attending weekly. During those 17 months, 481 of those new followers were baptized, and many of those who are already discipling others. Now, some years later, that field has seen groups multiplying over 16 generations. The original group has great to the 16th generation spiritual grandchildren. This movement has grown to the point that as of 2017, 3,434 people meet in these groups. During May 2018, 316 people gave their lives to Christ and were baptized, bringing the total added in the early 2018 to 1,254. Also during May 2018, 84 new groups sprang to life, making a total of 293 groups so far during 2018. As a whole, our workers worldwide have seen such a major increase in fruit since transitioning to DMM practices. See the accompanying graphs. During 2018, God raised up 1,549 new simple churches with 5,546 baptisms and a combined attendance at the end of 2018 of 41,191 souls. God is at work through 278 team expansion missionaries in some 40 countries. And there's 3 graphs. New churches, 1,549. And church attendance, 41,991. And baptisms, 5,546. And that is all in 2018. The transition. In years past, we've heard some horror stories about transitioning to DMM models for traditional proclamational or attractional approach. Some agencies like ours have reported that when they changed to DMM approaches, they lost 30 or 40% of their personnel. Apparently, some people don't like change. Thanks only to God above, we haven't yet seen that kind of disenfranchisement. Here are some factors that might be helping us. But keep in mind, these are only guesses and problems could arise at any time. From our early roots, our organization always treasured innovation. One of the 7 great passions of our 7 great passions is creative strategic perseverance until the results are achieved. We had pushed extraordinary prayer from the onset as well. Our first publication was a prayer calendar for our first field. Garrison's writing just sealed the deal with even further. So when DMM practices came along, they seemed culturally appropriate because they were already part of our DNA. It was hard to deny the fruit. First, we observed it in case studies we saw and in stories told by trainers. But then a couple of our early adopting teams experienced similar harvest. How could we argue with God's blessing in their ministry? Several of our senior leaders quickly embraced DMM practices. I, however, wasn't among them. I wasn't opposed, but I initially had trouble grasping it. The training seemed too fuzzy. It wasn't until I broke it down into practical bite-sized steps that I could say it was doable. See the outcome at moredisciples.com. We purposefully decided not to rush people in this transition. We allowed them time, in fact years. Once they saw fruit among their peers, it became easier for them to transition. Stories helped to ease the jump. We changed names of people and places, but told plenty of illustrations to convey the reality. Some stories were good news, while others were sobering. Senior leaders gently and humbly modeled the behavior for me, their president. But for complete alignment, I had to become personally involved. I couldn't just teach it, I had to do it. If your organization of church is considering transitioning DMM principles, try one of these options. Listen to the podcast and read the blog entries at www.moredisciples.com. Take a trial group through the Zoom training material at zoomproject.com. Read Stubborn Perseverance by James Nyman and Bobby Butler. Read T for T, A Discipleship Re-Revolution by Steve Smith and Ying Kai. Read Miraculous Movements, How Hundreds of Thousands of Muslims Are Falling in Love with Jesus by Jerry Trousdale. Read The Kingdom Unleashed, How Ordinary People Are Launching Disciple-Making Movements Around the World by Jerry Trousdale and Glenn Sunshine. Don't hesitate to contact Team Expansion for more updates on our journey, teamexpansion.org.